Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. Fridays are time to learn together. So we are excited that you have chosen to spend the next hour and a half with Pure Voice, North Carolina. This session is called 3Ps, a PSS tool for crisis planning. And what I'm hoping to do is share with each of you a process and a tool that I came across, actually developed over many years of supporting other people through crisis situations and wellness planning that I find kind of simple and easy to understand and use, that I hope that you will find it to be a useful tool as well. As with anything that we share, it's a tool, and it's just to be added to your toolbox. So I want to make sure we dig a little bit deep into it today and you all feel comfortable understanding what the 3Ps are and what this tool could look like and how you could use it in your work as a peer support specialist. So my name is Shireen Carrico. I am the project director of Pure Voice North Carolina. I am not on screen today because I am not feeling well, but I'm hoping that you will all have grace with me as we work through the next hour and a half together. We also do have Lynn on the line, and Lynn is going to be checking the chat throughout. She will be joining us, giving some of her own experience and some of her own thoughts. I also welcome you all to respond to questions in the chat or unmute yourself if you're comfortable doing that, because this is going to be an interactive webinar. So I find that it's really helpful for people to ask questions, ask clarification, and perhaps even use some of your own examples. So the chat is available for that, and so is unmuting yourself. So I wanted to start with a question, and it's a question that I've been asked for a really long time in different settings from different people. And it is the question of, can people actually recover from mental health issues and substance use issues? And that question is usually followed up by the second part is, how do you define recovery? So I wanted to make sure that we set the tone for today, that everything that we are focusing on with Pure Voice North Carolina and these webinars are really focused on well-being, resilience, and recovery. We do know both anecdotally and from data that the majority of people that have been labeled with serious mental illness or severe and persistent mental illness actually recover. And there is a definition. I'm sure many of you have seen this definition from SAMHSA. Recovery is a process of change through which individuals improve their health and well-being, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. So this is kind of the description that SAMHSA has adopted as its definition of recovery. If I were to ask each person on this phone call right now how you define recovery for yourself, it might be a little bit different. You might add some different aspects of it. It might look nothing like this particular definition, but we do want to make sure that we are discussing wellness planning and crisis planning through this lens. Partly it's because our system, our behavioral health system, historically has been designed around a medical model, which is in conflict a lot with a recovery approach, a recovery paradigm. And if we were to take a medical model and just create a visual of what that means for people who experience emotional distress, could experience crises, could experience different versions of emergencies, the model is based on this, that everybody has a baseline, and that at different times in our lives, we dip below the baseline for a whole bunch of reasons. That is called decompensation in a clinical system, a clinical model. And the goal then is to get you back up to baseline with different interventions. But it's not about, it's really a system of stabilization, functioning, and maintenance. It's not a system that is designed or has historically been designed around recovery. And so we see that in this visual that the goal is baseline, the goal is not recovery. When we look a little bit further at this, we understand that this model has a pretty clear focus. And the focus is on symptom reduction, use of medications, and stability. making sure the person has very little risk so that they don't what is called decompensate, and that stability, functioning, and maintenance is the goal in a medical model of behavioral health services. With research and examples and data and people sharing their own lived experience, there is a lot of challenge to this particular model. So if we look at this a little bit deeper, the medical model really focuses on monitoring mental health issues. There are pretty low expectations. As a matter of fact, oftentimes in this type of service, the expectation is that you get on disability benefits, that you go to a day program, perhaps you live in a residential program. Maybe some types of work would be okay, part-time or volunteer, but there's too much stress sometimes it's considered to go back to work or to have a career. The focus is often on the problem, which is usually your diagnosis and the symptoms connected to the diagnosis. Typically, the locus of control or the people that are in control is the treatment team, the psychiatrist and the doctor. It can also be a model of isolation where we as people with lived experience are expected to be passive recipients of services, not so much driving our own well-being and taking leadership in our own mental health, physical health, financial health, spiritual health. There is a strong focus on medication as the critical intervention in a medical model. We'll talk about that in a minute. And oftentimes things like privacy, confinement, hospital-based services are the focus. When we look at this in the community, we're seeing this play out with a lot of involuntary hospitalizations, psychiatric hospitalizations, and confinement due to mental health issues. And what we want to do is kind of explore how do we support people to take leadership over their well-being and utilize those environments as the last resort when they are necessary. Lynn, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity relative to this particular slide and the slide before. Is there anything you want to add to this?
I know, I just put in the text box, does this look familiar? Because I think it's important to recognize that we're a system in flux, that for the past 20 years, our system has said that it is moving towards or is a recovery-oriented system, but systems, any system, it takes a long, long time to change. And so my guess is when you think about where you're working and you think about your own experiences, you're going to see a lot of these medical model components, and especially medical model components that may not help or may even hinder striving towards recovery. And so it's really important to sort of think about those pieces. And in our work, how do we begin to influence those pieces to continue a change process? So that's the only thing I'd say on that, Shireen. Thank you, though.
Yeah, you're welcome. And the recognition that these things still persist within service provision. If we don't see it, we don't notice it, we're not aware of it, we don't recognize it, it's very difficult to shift the paradigm. And so part of the reason why we want to do these webinars is to create awareness that our traditional mental health systems were based on a paradigm of stabilization and maintenance. It was never based on a paradigm of recovery. We're starting to see that shift. We have been seeing since the 1990s a call to action or call to change toward a recovery-oriented approach. Our systems are still, by and large, designed around this medical clinical model, but that's where those of us with lived experience come in, is to challenge this when it shows up both in our individual treatment, our personal treatment, as well as in the services that we're providing in the organizations that we're working with. And so if we were to compare that with a recovery-based approach, this is more a visual that would demonstrate that we believe that everybody has the ability to recover. Oops, I lost my screen. Okay. And so in a recovery perspective, there's an expectation that over time that people recover. that we build a life, we get a life that we want, it's a quality of life, and that our emotional distress or mental health issues become one part of our experience, but it is not what defines our future, and that we can achieve more than stabilization, more than functioning, and more than maintenance. So in this visual, it shows that we expect that at different times in our lives, our mental health or emotional well-being will plateau. You know, we will kind of like hit a place where things are going along, things are okay, and then something will happen either to us, in our environment. Right now, we have a collective example of a lot of things that are happening that we are experiencing individually and collectively as a community. And so that takes into account that something may happen that causes distress that may impact our emotional well-being. But that thing, whatever it is, in addition to causing distress, it also causes us to learn. It creates an opportunity to learn new things, to become aware of things about ourselves, about others, our worldview, our well-being, that we wouldn't have otherwise had if we hadn't experienced that distress. And so in a recovery approach, the recognition is that everybody experiences distress. Everybody experiences emotional unwellness at different times. Everybody experiences issues related to their life that can feel really uncomfortable and may even feel insurmountable at the time, but that the goal is not for us to just bounce back to where we were. Our goal is to learn from it and become even stronger emotionally, mentally, physically as a result of having that experience. And so you'll see under Plateau B, it actually shows that there is growth from every experience that we have. Again, then we have a tendency as human beings to plateau wherever we're at. Something may happen, we experience distress, we learn from that distress, and then we grow beyond it to become even stronger in different ways. So this would be what the visual of a model or the recovery-based approach looks like when it's written out. The focus is very different in this model because the primary concern is not about the symptoms, it's not about medications, it's not even about treatment. The focus in the concern is about the person, whole health well-being, and how people are resilient enough to move beyond their circumstances. So when we compare that with the medical model, recovery says that we are broadening mental health and that we are expanding, or with every experience, we are growing and expanding our skills and our knowledge. There are high expectations. You know, Lynn asks a question, when somebody says, well, can I really work? Why couldn't you work? Why not you? Could I really own a home? Of course you could. Why not? Because in a recovery-based philosophy, we recognize that emotional distress and mental health is just one of our experiences, but that we are strong, resilient human beings, and that if we continue to expect little of people, that we continue to keep people stuck in an illness identity. So in recovery focus, self-management and wellness self-management becomes a key. Relationships, privacy, interdependence, community inclusion, all of these things are really what we focus on in a recovery-based approach. As peer support specialists, recovery is our blueprint. So everything that we do in our work is focused on our belief and our recognition that people recover from mental health and substance use issues. We want to move beyond this idea that the goal is for you to become stable, the goal is for you to simply be able to function, or the goal is maintenance. Those three things are very limiting to sense of self, and actually can be contrary to people moving forward in their lives. So in peer support, recovery is the blueprint for all of our interactions. It is the paradigm from which we operate in everything that we do. We support well-being and health in all different aspects, and that we don't use a symptom deficit medically based approach when we are working with people. Actually, as peer supporters, the labels become less significant, meaning that The diagnostic labels really are not relevant as a peer supporter in our relationship with somebody else. What's relevant is your experience of your life and where you want to be in comparison where you are. And then we utilize, obviously, the components of hope and strengths and respect and empowerment, personal responsibility to promote wellness. So I want to share with you some wellness planning tools that I have used over the years. I know we have used in our organization, and they really do help to reframe this illness, medical, disease sort of paradigm into one that is about wellness, self-management, whole health, and recovery. I want to start with the 8 dimensions of wellness. So that medical model that we're talking about, historically what has happened is the behavioral health system was reduced to focus only on mental health. So when you would show up, and in some situations it's still like this, when you show up to behavioral health services, the focus is on your emotional well-being, your thoughts, your symptoms, your mental health, your diagnoses. It's all about your mental health. What we have learned throughout the years through research is that mental health is one of many areas in our lives that can be impacted when we've experienced trauma, when we experience emotional distress, when we experience poverty, that we focus on whole health and whole well-being. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, did research and ended up narrowing down all of the different aspects that, if they are supported and if they are focused on, can actually lead to recovery. And that is what this visual is. So emotional well-being would be synonymous with mental health. And that's obviously a part of the work that we do, is supporting people around their emotional well-being. But that is not the sum of everything that we do. We should be supporting people around their financial recovery and financial wealth, understanding their financial situation and taking control over their financial situation, their sense of connection through social relationships and being a part of a community, and having relationships with family members or family of choice. Spiritual well-being can be critical to somebody's overall recovery. So expanding our sense of self, our purpose, our meaning, and how we define spirituality. Occupational well-being is all about having satisfaction with our work. And that work actually leads to recovery. We have historically believed in a medical model that you have to be stable and you have to be in recovery in order to work. What we have learned is the opposite is actually true, that work leads to recovery. If I don't have a purpose, a meaning, a reason to get up other than going to a treatment program, that is not a very hopeful life, right? And it also is a life that can lead to poverty. And so with occupational well-being, we are recognizing that our identities become critical and how we spend our time becomes critical as a recovery process. This next one, physical well-being, we have had more and more research now on the connection between our bodies and our minds. In the mental health system, we have focused primarily on our minds, and really at the neglect of our bodies when we come into services and treatment systems. That is starting to change. Several people on this call are part of an integrated care pilot that is bringing together physical well-being and emotional well-being, because we recognize that if our emotional health suffers, it will impact our physical health. And if our physical health suffers, it'll impact our emotional health. Well, I want to add on to that and talk about our financial health, our social, our spiritual, our occupational, our intellectual, and our environmental. And so as a recovery-based approach, when we think about wellness, we support people in all of these different areas, not just around mental health, symptoms, reduction of symptoms, and stabilization.
And that also means that we support people in all of these areas from a recovery perspective, which means that no matter which area that we're focusing on, it's really about working with the person and finding out from them which areas are important to them. As we brought in more integrated health, and not so much in anybody who's on the call specifically or your programs, but what we've seen a lot in the community is a lot of we're recovery, except we're going to do coercive wellness. You will be well physically. You will go to the doctors because we're telling you to. And so we're bringing a lot of the paternalism from the mental health system over into the physical health in some cases. So we want to be really mindful that all of these areas start from person choice and the person's desire to focus on these, because for any of us, we're never doing all 8 of these to the same intensity at any time. We choose what's our priority right now and what do we want to back burner for a while. And that same dignity needs to go to people with support.
Yeah, and Nibel said in the chat that you're seeing things are getting a bit better, but there is still a focus on hospitalization as the solution and focusing on medications. Julie's talking about disability benefits. That's a huge bugaboo in a recovery community, because getting on disability benefits also puts you below the poverty level. And when you are below the poverty level, you also don't have access to healthcare. You don't have access to even basic things like having a home, a mortgage, being able to go on vacation. And so part of the shift toward recovery is to stop limiting people based on our clinical view, based on their diagnosis, based on our limited beliefs and their ability to actually have a life and be well, and to challenge this systemic use of disability as a way to disenfranchise people, to utilize hospitals when it's needed, but that is not the first. I wouldn't even say that should be the 10th approach. That should be the last on the list. And the use of medications are a tool in the recovery community. That is not where your recovery lies. For some people, medications can be very helpful. For other people, they're harmful. But our focus is to help you explore what works for you. And if it works for you, great. And if it doesn't, that's okay. Ariel is saying everyone can work. Anna was saying purchasing a home was a big part of her own recovery process. Yeah, and so we all know these things because of our own lived experience, right? Recovery is about having a life, getting a life, and not a life that is simply surrounded by treatments and medications and diagnostics and interventions, but an actual life that allows us to have quality and continue. A big component of that is what we call wellness self-management. And so here's another example of the distinction between a medical model and a recovery model. In a medical model, we've historically believed that the treatment provider has the solutions, has the power, has the answers, and that it was their role to make sure that we do what we're supposed to do. They set the goals for us, that we are not too stressed out. But all of the influence came in the treatment system. What recovery does is it shifts that level of control to us as individuals and says, if I want to be well, I have to take responsibility for my own well-being. I have the right to take responsibility. And with that responsibility means I need to know my options, I need to have information, I might need supports, I might need resources, but truly, wellness can be and should be my responsibility. So the definition of wellness self-management is about having a sense of control over your life, including control of your emotional well-being, learning and practicing ways to respond to life's challenges. I don't know about you, but I've gained a lot of skills and learned a lot of areas over the past 3 months that I have not developed skills as we are going through this collective crisis. And I'm learning how to respond to both my physical well-being and emotional issues that have come up during the past several months. The third one is developing resiliency. So building our muscles of well-being and health and resiliency, because all of those things reduce the likelihood that we will need to end up being re-hospitalized or hospitalized for the first time. And then self-care is a huge part of wellness self-management. When we look at research, and I didn't put the data in here, I just wanted to leave this as a really simple comment. Studies show that self-management is critical to recovery. That if we continue to be in a paradigm where we are just passive recipients of treatment, we just go along with whatever treatment providers say, is important for us, we just take our medications and we just go to our programs, that is a life that leads to stabilization, to maintenance. But that is not necessarily a life that leads to recovery and well-being. Very similar to what we do in the physical realm. If you have any sort of physical health condition, diabetes, blood pressure issues, cardiac issues, we have to have a lifestyle that supports our well-being. It's the same thing with mental health and emotional well-being. So it really is about learning how life and life circumstances impact us, what makes it better, what makes it worse, and what can I do to respond to life situations so that I don't end up having to go back to the hospital, I don't end up in an emergency situation. And that is really what we focus on with wellness self-management. So the 3 Ps is a tool for wellness self-management.
I just want to say one thing here, Shireen. When we, thank you, leave that slide up, because these ideas may seem very evident as we read it and we go, well, of course. These ideas very well may be revolutionary and terrifying to people that we support. And we've talked about this in other lunch and learns, the idea of learned or taught helplessness, that the more deeply involved someone has been in systems, especially over time, that they learn to be helpless and to look to others to give them the answers, because along the line they've been told that's really what they're supposed to do. And so when we come along now and say, well, it's your life, it's your body, it's your mind, it's your responsibility, that's really scary for people, because it can easily be interpreted as, oh my God, you're going to take my services away from me and I can't survive if you do that. So a lot of this stuff, it's just even introducing and exposing people to some of these ideas before you even start recognizing that people may push back because it's so terrifying.
Yeah, Lynn, I remember the point where I realized that if I wanted to recover, if I wanted to build my life that is not surrounded by hospitals and treatments only, that I had to take a level of responsibility for my well-being. And it was both frightening as well as freeing, because I realized that the answer is not going to come in somebody else, in a treatment provider, a case manager, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or even a little blue pill. I had been taught that that's where it came from. And when those things were not working for me, they were not leading me to a better life, a more well state of being, I really felt a sense of hopelessness. Like, oh, I am the exception to the rule. I'm doing everything that I've been told to do. I'm taking medications, I'm going to programs and services, and I'm still feeling like this. What I had to realize is that my well-being wouldn't come in those other forms, that those were tools that may be helpful, may not be helpful, but I had to understand what was happening inside my mind, inside my body, inside my brain, and to become an active champion of my own recovery. I had to learn, I had to research, I had to try things out, I had to fail, I had to succeed. But that is really when my recovery started, was when I took leadership over my well-being.
I agree, and I think that's very common. And but I think other folks will retreat even more. And so this is another one of those places where the great power of peer support is so important, so that we're not in a position where we're telling people that, the way that you're going to feel better is when you really start to look at yourself and blah, blah, blah. It's when we really share our own story and plant the seed for them. It's less threatening, and it's a way that people can hear it better. And so it's one of the 1,000 and 3,000, whatever number of ways that being supporting people from the vantage point of peer support is so helpful and so necessary.
Absolutely. And it's demonstrating, right? It's being that model or that mentor that we recover. That is the truth. And so that it may be less scary if I see other people around me that have done it or have been successful. That could be a huge game changer for people.
Absolutely.
And so we say that we need a plan, a plan A, a plan B, perhaps a plan C or a plan D. If we think about everything that we plan for in our lives, we will recognize that planning is actually a natural part of the human experience. I had to plan for this webinar. Now, I didn't plan on being sick today, so that's my plan B, right? My plan B is I'm not feeling well. I'm asking Lynn to be involved and help me out. But I came in with a plan. And oftentimes we plan for huge things like weddings and birthdays and events. Yet when we talk about our emotional well-being in crisis situations, oftentimes people are left without a plan. And so what we want to do is share one process and one tool with you today that you can utilize for yourselves, you can utilize with people that you are supporting, with family members. It's a very simple way of developing a crisis or wellness plan, and it's called the 3 Ps. The 3 Ps stand for predict, prevent, and plan. And we will go through all 3 of those things. So I want to start by giving context, because if we don't have this context, the rest of it is not going to make sense. So I'm going to spend a good deal of time on that slide. For those of you that are taking notes, what I'm going to ask you to do is create something on a piece of paper that looks like this. Potentially, you can call it a volcano, whatever that image looks like. But this is the image that has been put out there for the stages of crisis, that all people, every single one of us, go through different stages when we experience emotional distress. The top of that hill is obviously like the tipping point of significant distress. The bottom of it is where it begins, and then we come out the other end. But if we were to illustrate it, it would look something like this. It can look different ways, but we're going to use this illustration for today. And so the first part of it is what we all know. We've heard the term triggers, activation. If you're in a trauma focused approach, you can use the word activation. But something happens that really ignites our emotional response in many different ways. It's an activating event. What is triggering for one person may not be triggering for another person. So we also recognize that, but something happens in this particular stage that ignites a reaction in internal distress. And after that happens, once that goes on, we start to see that there are signs. Some people call it early warning signs. Some people call it moving into advanced warning signs. But if we were to illustrate it, it looks like this. So something has happened on the bottom. We are starting to activate, and we are starting to show signs and to feel different things within our bodies that something has happened that has caused us emotional distress. This is called, in the stages of crisis model, this is called the escalation phase. And the beginning of it is called the triggering phase. So the trigger, something has happened that has caused us to start escalating our emotions, our thoughts, our internal nervous system starts being activated. And this is what it looks like when it becomes mapped out. If we do not catch those things early enough, if we don't recognize it at the early warning signs and do different things to relieve our distress, then it can continue to escalate. And that leads to advanced warning signs. So that's when things are just starting to get out of control. It's gone on a little too long, maybe. And we haven't figured out the best way to support ourselves or to ask for support during this. And so it continues to escalate. Beyond advanced warning signs, the next stage of a crisis is, well, it's a crisis. So when you get to the top corner, that is when it is officially a crisis. Something has happened on the bottom. We are being activated. We are feeling things in our body. We are demonstrating signs that we're experiencing distress. We haven't quite figured out yet how to relieve our distress, or other people, what supports could be helpful to prevent it from becoming a crisis, and then it turns into a crisis.
I was going to say, and a great analogy is the volcano. You know, that things can be just low-lying, sort of way deep in it, But as more and more gets added on, the pressure begins to build until finally it blows because it's just gone on building and building and building. That's all.
I'm sorry, I was muted. When it comes to relieving the distress and preventing it from getting to the point of crisis, where do you all think the best points are to intervene, either ourselves around de-stressing and self-care, or with other people intervening to support us through it? Where would you think the best, most ideal places on the left-hand side of this would be around intervention? You can type it in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
Hi, Shireen.
Yes.
This is Cedric.
Hey, Cedric.
Hey, I just wanted to chime in based on your question. I think it's early intervention starts with ourselves, because once you realize what your triggers are, that'll prevent you from going to this next level as far as the escalation phase, you know. So I think once you realize what triggers you and what those things are, you'll have a better understanding of, you know, of who you are, so that way you won't respond in a way that'll continue to escalate. Does that make sense?
It completely makes sense, and I agree with you, absolutely.
Yeah, and Juan is also chiming in saying the same thing, and that it's really in that triggering phase. And Ariel's agreeing that really that more awareness, and I know that's what we're going to be talking about, really makes the difference at that early spot. And Nibel is also talking about recognizing, you know, those things that activate or set off. I always think of it as the alarm bell, the danger signal in my brain that starts to chime off, you know, when it's activated by something around us. Although I love Nibel's other comment that sometimes we need a little volcano to feel better and to have greater clarity. But that's a different webinar when we talk about crisis as opportunity. Go ahead, Shireen.
No, absolutely. And you know, the thing is that yes, crisis can be an opportunity for us to grow and learn. Many crises, however, can be prevented if we either intervene early on with somebody that we're supporting because we recognize the stress in them, or they do the things that are helpful to them early on to prevent it from becoming a crisis. At the point where it's a crisis, here becomes the risk. It turns into an emergency, right? We all know crisis. We're experiencing collective crisis right now. We can plan for crisis situations. We can, in some circumstances, in many circumstances, even prevent a crisis with a really good, solid plan. I would say in terms of intervening, the crisis is not the ideal place for us to be intervening. And yet that's what happens a lot. Somebody's experiencing significant distress, they're experiencing a crisis. Now as a peer support specialist, we are trying to intervene to help prevent it from becoming an emergency. We have to.
And Darcy said, you know, the earlier the better. And part of this is because it's really about the inside job, because there are crises that we'll be confronted with outside in the world that we'll never have any role in trying to stop. But it's really how we respond inside. That's where really sort of our crisis planning can be.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so the earlier that we are responding or that other people are helping us through the activation, the more likely it is that we reduce not only it becoming a crisis, but becoming an emergency. And we'll talk about the difference between the two. After a crisis or an emergency has happened, usually there's a downward trend, right? And there are three things that can happen. Nibel, I believe, said, sometimes we need a little volcano to feel better. So that would be a higher level. That means that we learn from this experience, we have gained something, more knowledge, more skills around our own wellness, and we have grown as a result of it. Sometimes there's no change at all. We go through the crisis, we are just relieved that it's over, but we continue in the same path doing the same things without a lot of change. And then there's a lower level. If a crisis turns into an emergency is a point where we start losing things. That's where we become hospitalized. That's where we start losing our home, potentially become homeless, potentially become incarcerated. And that would be an example of a lower level result of a crisis that wasn't handled that turned into an emergency. This phase is called the recovery phase, okay? So there's the triggering phase, the escalation phase, the crisis phase, and the recovery phase if we were to map out what a crisis looks like. You're gonna see in here the starting of the P's. So I told you there are 3 P's: predict, prevent, plan. You see predict under the triggering phase. That is where that portion of the plan becomes really critical when we go through the 3 P's. Under prevent, what we are doing is putting a plan in place to prevent a crisis from occurring, or if we can't prevent a crisis, at least prevent it from becoming an emergency. And the plan covers all of the different phases, including the post-crisis situation. What have we learned from it? Where do we go from here? What do we have to change in our support systems, in our lives, in our plan to make sure that we are better prepared the next time around so it doesn't result in a crisis or it doesn't result in an emergency. So it's important.
Oh, go ahead.
No, please, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's so absolutely important, because even though we may come out of a crisis or an emergency having learned lessons, it's the spots where we're not in those crises where we have the maximum amount of self-power, of empowerment. And as we get into those crisis situations, so often, and this was what Fred was saying, which I fully agree with, so often we begin to lose our power. In those places where we're going from crisis to emergency, other people are stepping in often and taking our power away. And so the more we can stay in those empowered places rather than places where our power is taken away and we become disempowered, the better towards our overall movement forward.
So that's a perfect segue into this. What is the difference between a crisis and emergency, right? So if we have this plateau here, things continue to escalate, and it turns into a crisis. They continue to escalate beyond a crisis into an emergency. What is the difference? What is a crisis and what is an emergency? And what is the difference between the two, do you all think? Let's start with something simple. What's the difference between a crisis and emergency?
This is Fred. I think one of the differences might be a crisis may be identified by the person, and an emergency starts to move into other people to determining, that it is an emergency. That may not make any sense, but.
It completely makes sense. We can work through crisis situations. At the point where it becomes emergency, other people are intervening on our own behalf, right? That is where 911 is being called. That is where the police are showing up. That is where we are being hospitalized, being incarcerated. Our homes are being removed from us. That is an emergency. That is the place where external intervention comes in and we lose control over the results of what happens. A crisis, on the other hand, is something that we all can relate to. We all experience different crises. It doesn't have to become an emergency, and a good plan with the sound support system, good solid wellness skills, all can help prevent it from becoming an emergency. We lose control in an emergency. In a crisis, we still have the ability to learn from it, bounce back from it, and not have it go in the direction that we start losing our independence and our freedom and our voice. So I really like the way that you said that, Fred.
Absolutely. And Nibel and Juan similarly said, there's an imminence to emergency. Crisis is that state of incredible emotional distress. But there comes a point where imminent action has to be taken. And that's where we're really seeing this idea of emergency.
Right, and part of what I ask people when I talk to them is, how have you gotten through crises in the past, emotional distress in the past? You haven't lived your entire life in a hospital. You haven't lived your entire life in an institution necessarily. There are things that you have learned along the way or done that have worked for you. What are those things? It's just that we are not accustomed to people asking us those questions, or accustomed to having the freedom, if you will, to really self-reflect and learn about ourselves, our own circumstances, our own bodies, and put plans in place that could be helpful to prevent it from becoming a crisis or an emergency, right?
And we're not accustomed to sitting with hard feelings. We just jump to the idea of fix it, and so in an emergency, fix it is take action. Oftentimes, an emergency is a time, or a crisis rather, is a time when people are just feeling really strong, hard feelings. And what that requires of us, which can be equally difficult, is to sit and hold those feelings without jumping to action, right? And so part of the action sometimes can be ourselves trying to relieve ourselves from having to hold those hard feelings.
Sorry, I was muted. So I really love the illustration on the left. This for me captures what I thought recovery would look like. I thought, okay, there would be a point in my life where it was smooth sailing and it was just upward from here. And the reality that I've experienced in my life looks more like the right-hand side in this illustration. It's all over the place. There are circumstances out of our control that happen on a daily, weekly basis. COVID happened without anybody being fully prepared or planning for it. Things happen, right? But when those things happen, they don't have to result in a hospital every time, or they don't have to result in an emergency every time. It's just the fact that we live lives, and in our experience, can be all over the place. The question is, do we have a really good solid foundation to work through the distress without ending up in an emergency situation? So crisis versus emergency. So this is just two different definitions. One, I think you said it really well and very succinctly. A crisis is something that happens that could result in reduced levels of functioning. It is distress that happens that could result. An emergency requires immediate intervention. Unfortunately, within our communities and within our behavioral health system, we have come to see everything as emergency, right? And so we are using 911 and we are using hospital intervention during all types of experiences, treating a crisis like it's an emergency, when we could actually avoid a lot of that with a good, solid plan in place. And so where a crisis plan comes in is it helps develop a plan for when we feel activated, how we can tell, how others can tell, how we can prevent it from becoming a crisis if possible. If it becomes a crisis, what do we do? And how can people help to prevent it from becoming an emergency? And if it were to become an emergency, what do we want to happen then? So good crisis plan actually takes into account both the crisis and emergency, and the entire chart that I just shared with you, the entire illustration that I just shared with you. So crisis can lead to an emergency, but with a good plan, it doesn't have to. So the 3 P's of a crisis plan, they stand for predict, prevent, and plan. And I have found this to be one of the most simple ways of developing a crisis plan with people. I have used this approach with young people, with family members, with adults over, 22 years now. I have used the 3 P's of crisis planning. We've utilized it within our organization. And what we have found is it's a very simple way of supporting people to learn about their well-being take control over their planning process and develop a plan that becomes adjusted as needed, but is truly usable to the person and anybody that they choose to be a part of their well-being. And so under predict, you're going to see the image of the fire. Under prevent, I've used the illustration of the fire extinguisher, and under plan, I've used the example of the firefighters. So just from these three words, without describing what they are, what do you all think predict would mean when you're developing a crisis plan? What are we predicting, and what do you think that section of a crisis plan would include?
Quiet bunch today.
It is. Let me ask it differently. Let's bring it away from mental health. What about a fire in your house? How do you predict a situation like that? What are the things you need to know?
So I'll throw out a starter point to help people get thinking. If I'm in my new house and I'm looking around and I'm trying to predict where fires might start, the first thing I'm going to do is look at my stove and see what shape it's in, and have some awareness of any vulnerabilities based on where my stove is placed. Things like that. I'm going to take a scan and understand the landscape.
Yes. So you're looking at your home. If this were a crisis plan for fire, you're looking at your home and you're trying to understand where could potentially be the sources of a fire starting in my home, and what state are they in? What do they look like? And then what do I need to do in my home to prevent it from happening? So you're looking at your stove, you're looking at your outlets, you're checking your fire alarms. That is an example of predict. When we get to the mental health side of things, what is it that we are drawing off of to be able to predict whether we become at risk of emotional distress or a crisis?
And I would say go back and think about that that graphic that we used for a while with the little, you know what that thing is? That thing, yeah, thank you.
Potato.
I love that we just think together, even when my words come out backwards.
Yep. What are we predicting? So Julie says, know what's happening based on knowing myself. Absolutely. It's self-knowledge. Knowing me, what are the types of things that I have to be aware of in order to predict when I'm at risk for being activated or I'm at risk for ending up in a crisis situation?
Right, what are my triggers? What are those things that set me off? Where am I the most vulnerable? I know for me, a great one is if I don't sleep, right? Right there, that's a trigger. And I can predict every time if I don't sleep, by 2 o'clock the next afternoon, I'm gonna be in tears. Just the way it works.
That's right. So under the predict section comes your triggers. What are the types of situations that feel activating to you? And we know that every person, it's different, right? We are predicting based on what has happened in the past when we've experienced crisis, emotional distress, or emergency, based on what we know about ourselves or we're learning about ourselves. We are predicting these are the circumstances that can happen that can result in a crisis situation or activation of emotional distress. So under predict, these are the types of questions that we want to ask ourselves. And as a peer support specialist, we may be asking somebody else as they're developing their crisis plan. Number one, what is a crisis versus an emergency? Because we know that the level of distress tolerance that we all individually have is very unique to us. If I were to lose my home and end up on the street, that would be an emergency to me. I know people that wouldn't even be a crisis to them. It's something that they're accustomed to. They don't experience it in that way. And so first we have to understand, what does a crisis look like to me? How does it feel? And is there anything that's associated with a crisis that I need to develop a really good plan for, right? So for example, what is a crisis to me? Potentially a memory or an anniversary of past trauma makes me feel activated, makes me feel sad, makes me feel depressed, makes me feel hopeless. I start isolating as a result of it. And I have a tendency to then harm myself. That would be the example of the top of this if you were to ask me these questions of what a crisis looks like to me. The same questions we're going to ask around an emergency. What is an emergency to me? What is it to you? How does it feel? How does it look? And what are the things that we need to be able to plan for? And the question is, what causes both of these things? All of those things go under the predict part of a crisis plan. So let's compartmentalize that a little bit, or pull that apart a little bit. Why is it important to know what can cause a crisis or an emergency for yourself? Why is that knowledge important?
Because if you don't know where you're vulnerable, then you won't even see it coming down the pike.
That's exactly right. So some people will say, I went from 0 to 10 in a second, right? That is a person that has not yet practiced the awareness and the reflection to know what is happening, what has happened that has triggered the situation, what it feels like, and what it looks like. So knowing those situations that can cause a crisis or emergency becomes critical. If
One way I think of it, it's really recognizing what train is going to come down the track and knock me over, right? Because if I can know what sets that train in motion, then I can recognize and maybe eliminate some of the things so the train doesn't get started, or I will know the minute it gets started, oh, this is going to set my train off down the tracks. And this is a good time to figure out, how do I get off the tracks now, right? So it's really that thing of knowing what puts us personally in danger.
And there are a lot of things to be aware of, to maybe explore with people as a peer support specialist that they may not even be aware of themselves. Because as Fred said, self-awareness, if you've never had the space to really understand yourself because you've relied on other people to intervene or to tell you what to do, or just take your meds and go to treatment, you may have never developed that self-awareness to even realize the circumstances that create vulnerability for you. I know people that every year around the same time of their birthday, they end up in a crisis situation. I have known people, I worked with a young woman once that every time she had been hospitalized, she actually had her menses, she had her period. That is important to know, because something was going on inside her during those times that led an emergency, a crisis, and then emergency to happen. We can plan for that, and we could support her to prevent it from becoming a crisis. Fred says, if you know, you can prepare.
And I think, there's something about when you are in systems, part of what you learn is that you have this biological defect in your brain, and that there's a real randomness to it, and you just have to expect it's going to go off, almost like the Grim Reaper who jumps out of a tree at the most unpredictable of times. And that teaching leads people to feel helpless and have no sense of control or power. And part of what these conversations are about is really helping people to know that it's actually not that random, that actually the pathway from A to Z can often be charted out through conversations to help people gain that awareness of what it looks like. And then people can feel more in control, and have more of a sense of power, which can really make a difference for folks.
So on that same vein, Lynn, so it's important to understand what causes or could cause a crisis, could activate us. Why is it also important to know what it feels like inside our body when we have been activated? Why is that a critical part of this wellness self-management or self-awareness, do you think?
A great question.
Fred is saying, if you know, you can also share with others, right? So if I know what it feels like inside me when I am in distress, I can share that with other people, but I also can recognize those early cues in my body that says, oops, I need to develop, I need to do this, or I need to have my wellness plan, or I need to call for help, or I need to go take a walk or go to the dog park, whatever it is. If we are so disconnected from our bodies that we can't tell when we are experiencing emotional distress, it could easily then turn into a situation that becomes out of control. So we want to support people as peer supporters to key into their body cues that you are not feeling well, that something is not right inside you. The earlier that we can detect it in ourselves, the earlier we can do things to help resolve it.
And this sort of goes down two trains. On the one hand, there's sort of those anxiety kinds of feelings, the racing heart or the sweaty hands or things like that say, oh my God, my emotional danger systems are going off. There's also other body triggers that people have that come from trauma, because we carry trauma in the body. And so exploring this with people, sometimes you find out that every time my ankle hurts, it's because of this other thing that happened over there that may not feel connected, but because of the trauma history, there's just a body place that carries that, because at times in life it was too dangerous to hold it in your mind and heart. And so people can also begin to recognize those. What body sensation that's really weird is actually a repeated sensation and is actually trying to send me a message.
That's right. And as we're talking about the connection between physical self and emotional well-being, sometimes our emotional health actually comes out in physical ailments. I know for me, that is absolutely the truth. One of my indications that I am not sleeping enough, I'm overworking, I am not finding a balance is when I start to get sick. That is my body's way of slowing me down if I have not slowed myself down. And so sometimes when people show up with medical issues, it can be connected to emotional distress, but they don't realize yet that that is their body's way of signaling to them that they are experiencing emotional distress. So those physical cues internally become a critical thing for me to become self-aware of, and for all of us to be aware of, because it actually may not be medical. It might be. It may not be medical at all, though. It might be connected to our emotional well-being, and that is our body signaling. Fred says that she experiences neck and back issues when she's experiencing distress. So those are important things to know and to include in the plan, because once I am feeling activated, once I am feeling triggered, sometimes what can happen is I'm not stopping and thinking about, oh, that's emotional distress. Oh, I need to do something about it. If I have it down in writing, in a plan that feels usable to me, that may help me recall what I can do to alleviate that distress. What about the other part of what does it look like? Why do you think it's important for people around us to know what it looks like when we are experiencing distress? So it's identifying the things that can trigger it, identifying what that feels like inside my body once I've been triggered, but there's a third part of it, and that's identifying what it looks like to others. Lynn, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I can give a great example. Back in the old days when we actually saw each other face to face, I would know by what Shireen was wearing. about where she was at. You know, there are different clothes for sort of different places. And I could tell from the clothes that she was wearing when she was struggling. Just a sort of attire that she would come in that would let me know, ooh, today's a struggle day for Shireen.
Those things are really critical. I remember I once had an injection of steroids, and this was before I realized, I did not know that when you have major depressive disorder and you take steroids, that it actually can create suicidal thoughts and reactions. I didn't know that. And I had this injection of steroids, and within 24 hours, I started experiencing suicidal thoughts. Within 48 hours, I started experiencing psychosis. Luckily for me, I was connected enough to my well-being to realize something was going on and to not act on the thoughts and the feelings that I had. But people around me at that time described what I looked like and said, you literally look like a different person when you are experiencing distress, and started to share with me the signs that they have seen in me that let them know, Shireen is struggling. That's really important to me to be aware of, and it's important for me that people that care about me also recognize those signs, because if I happen to not see it myself, I relied on other people around me to say, are you okay? Lynn just did this with me last night.
Right.
Close the computer. Do not put together this PowerPoint for tomorrow. You need some sleep. You are experiencing distress. That happened last night. And you're absolutely correct. You saw the signs and you've seen them coming for the last couple of weeks, that I was at a higher risk at this point. Mm-hmm.
And Julie did a great example about how her daughter can pick up, and she'll come carefully to her, but say, I think you need a meeting. Just by the way she's sort of talking to her daughter and sort of her racing thoughts are up there, her daughter can pick it right up. Mom, go to a meeting. Love that, Julie.
Exactly. Sometimes it takes a village. I can tell you it takes a village to raise a Shireen. And I know I'm not alone in that, right?
5 villages, I'd say, in that one.
5 villages to raise a Shireen. And sometimes I am not in a place where I recognize it myself, and I rely on people around me to say, are you okay? What's going on? I noticed this, Shireen. What's going on?
Yeah.
Where do we go from here? What do we do? All of those things.
I was going to say, and sadly, as Fred mentioned, a lot of times this is not included in sort of our mental health assessments or in the mental health plans, all these body triggers and stuff. It's really an important area, and it's part of being really more trauma sensitive and trauma informed. It's such a way that our bodies communicate. And so really, you know, helping people recognize it for themselves and helping them either communicate to or find out from the people that are close to them and supporting them, what does it look like? Because that is how we do it as a village.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are tools. If you were to all Google different tools, you would find that there are inventories that people can take, like self-guided inventories of what is happening inside my body, how I feel distress, how it shows up inside my body. And there are also inventories for behavioral cues. Those are some tools that you can share with people and work on together so that you're doing it for yourself, they're doing it for themselves, and then you're sharing it with each other, so that we are building that sense of self-awareness. But those inventories already exist. When we think about triggers or activation, there are a lot of different categories we want people to think through and be aware of. These are just a few. Individual people can be a huge trigger to us. Right? I used to, when I worked with kids and somebody would label a kid with oppositional defiant disorder, and I would get to know that kid and I would realize they were only oppositionally defiant when one particular person entered the room, I knew that that was related to their relationship with that person. It was not related to a diagnosis or a clinical issue. Different people can just rub us the wrong way, remind us of something, or just trigger us. Same thing with tone of voice or certain phrases that people say can be triggers. It's important for us to know that. Certain places can be triggers. Memories or thoughts Isolation. What's happening right now is that people are experiencing a significant level of triggering because of the isolation and the disconnection we're feeling from each other. A memory related to a trauma, an abuse situation. Tragedies obviously can be a trigger. There can be environmental triggers. I know there are certain smells, there are certain songs, and there are certain textures that trigger me. I know that about myself, and I need to be aware of what those things are so I either can avoid them when possible or work through them when I can't avoid them. Illness or injury, unmet basic needs, patterns and cycles, anniversaries, weekends, different time of the day, different times of the month, holidays, all of those types of patterns or cycles can be triggers. The great thing about this is you can put a plan in place just focused on your triggers. I know every Sunday at this time, it is really difficult for me because it's when other people get together with their families. I don't have a family, so Sundays are typically really tough. Can I develop a plan for the weekend so I can prepare for Sunday and work through Sunday? That's an example of a crisis plan, of the use of a crisis plan.
Sorry, I just want to mention it's 1:15. That's all. Just wanted to give you a heads up.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. And so I put this out there so when you get the slide, if the bubbles are not enough, you just have some descriptions of situational triggers, basic need trigger, personal, mental health triggers, and I've gone on to share a couple of others. Examples of environmental, medical, financial, unmet needs. This can help to start build the conversation with people around self-awareness so they start really thinking about the situations that really do put them at risk of a crisis situation. Same thing with hair triggers. Lynn, you already said if you don't get enough sleep that you are at greater risk. We want people to understand their hair triggers as well and put that in their plan so that they, as well as their support system, are aware of the circumstances in which they could result in a crisis situation. All of that goes into the predict portion of the 3P plan. As to early warning signs, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What things change? How do I communicate differently? All of those are early warning signs, and same thing with advanced warning signs. Those all go under the first P, which is predict. Okay, so the second P is prevent. So the question in this is, what do I need to do after I've been triggered? I know the early warning signs. I know that I am struggling. What can I do to prevent it from becoming a crisis situation? There are some very simple things that go under the prevention portion of a crisis plan. One is your wellness toolbox, and I'm going to be a little bit more specific about that. Wellness tools often follow under 3 different categories. People that I can reach out to that are helpful, that help me feel supported, that help me heal and help soothe me. Who are those people that I can reach out to when I'm experiencing distress to prevent it from becoming a crisis? The second one is places that I can go that help me feel safe. It could be a place in my home. It could be a place in my yard. It could be a place in the community. It could be a church. It could be somebody else's house. It could be a particular tree at my home. But what are the places that I know help me feel safe and help me calm? And the third thing that goes into the wellness toolbox are the activities. What are the things that I can do to help me through these situations? One of the things that I like to do as a peer support specialist is actually develop a literal wellness toolbox with people. It can be a toolbox that you get at Lowe's or Home Depot. It could be a Tupperware box. It doesn't matter what it looks like as long as the person chooses what their wellness toolbox is. And in that toolbox are all these tools, the names of people, their pictures. If I just need to be reminded that my children are my strength, I can open up my toolbox, pull out the picture, look at it when I'm feeling distressed. The phone numbers of those people, how to access them. pictures of the places that help me calm, or reminders of those places. It might be the beach, and so I might have a seashell, and I might decide, you know what, I'm feeling really distressed right now. Perhaps over the weekend I can go to the beach. It might be a synagogue, but pictures or reminders of those places, so that when I'm feeling activated, all I need to do is go to this toolbox, pick it up and go, oh yeah, that's right. If I go this place, it can be really helpful to me. And the third one are the activities. So knitting, bubbles for bubble baths, pictures, songs. We used to do this with CDs if there are particular songs that were helpful when we used to use CDs. Journals, any activity that I am willing to try that has helped me in the past, or I'm willing to try when I'm feeling distressed, that will help me to calm and soothe. The reason why we put it in a literal toolbox is when we are experiencing distress, oftentimes we need something concrete. It is not the time where we are necessarily able to think through, because it's so ignited inside of our body that our ability to rationalize it can also be impacted. If I learned that my toolbox is filled with the things, the people, the places, and the activities that I can pick up and actually go to try to do when I'm feeling distressed, what we have found is that that can be really helpful with people. This is definitely a role for a peer support specialist, right? So as we're defining triggers, we're also writing them down with people, and we are writing down the people, places, and activities and helping people develop a wellness toolbox. All of that goes under the prevention part of the plan. The other thing that goes under the prevention is if I were to call somebody or they were to come help me, specifically what they can do that is helpful and what they should avoid doing because it is harmful. That goes under the prevention piece of the 3 Ps. So if I'm calling somebody, what am I asking from them to do? What should they know that is helpful for me when I call them and I'm feeling distressed? What do they know that actually they should avoid because it will make it worse? That goes under the prevention side. The third P is the plan. And this is, okay, I'm in a crisis situation. Who, what, where, when, and how? Who can help me? What can they do? How can I access them? This is the step-by-step plan of what helps and what hinders to prevent a crisis from becoming an emergency. These are the actual interventions and the supports. This is also the place to have your advanced directives, and it's a place for in-advance decisions. If 911 is going to be called, under what circumstances are they going to be called, and who's going to call them? If I do need to go to the hospital, what hospital do I prefer? What will I never agree to? What do I want to happen? Who will take care of my dogs or my pets or my flowers or whatever? Who will pay my bills? So under the plan is all of the strategies to prevent it from becoming an emergency, as well as if it were to become an emergency, who is going to do what, when, how, and where, and what are my preferences. So that is the third section of your predict, prevent, and plan. When we build this out, I ended up leaving you all with this. This is a template. You can use this template or just use it for the information that's on the template. But I described in all 3 of these sections what the types of questions are that I'm asking somebody, what the type of information is that I need to know about myself under predict. Same thing with prevent, including the wellness toolbox information is under there. And same thing under plan. All of the different things that go into the planning portion of your crisis plan. So I want to pause there and see if there are any thoughts or questions as we start to wind down. Keeping in mind that this is an actual training that I do over an entire day to practice how to actually do this. But we wanted to share with you the information so you could take it back and start using it and trying it out in your own personal life, as well as a peer support specialist. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Julie said that's a great idea, an actual toolbox. Julie, I have done it with many, 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 many people over the years, and I have found that to be one of the most effective ways to prevent a crisis and to prevent an emergency is having a literal toolbox that
I
the
love that
person
you brought-
is developing. Mhm.
Yeah, I love that you brought that out, and the fact that really in those moments of crisis, you know, and it's a physiological thing that actually goes on that makes us so much less able to use that part of our mind that problem solves and create solutions. It's just not there when we're in distress. So to have something nice and concrete that I developed and I designed and I decided what kind of box and what I want in it, it's a real, just even to hold it brings some comfort. It's a great strategy, and really letting people be as creative as they want in building it. It's great activities that you can do over time with folks and really let them take ownership of it, which is, again, so empowering.
Yeah, it's kind of the point. And I would add to that, people can be really, really specific about it. So Julie, you said watching TV can be a tool for you. If I were working with you, I would want to know, what do you mean by watching TV? What types of shows are helpful to you? What types of shows or movies do you want to avoid? Same thing with music, right? Sometimes people say music helps. Well, that's not necessarily the case. There are certain songs that actually can make it worse. So we want people to really explore, is there a particular song? Is there a particular artist? Is there a particular type of TV show that is helpful to you?
Alice Cooper, I'm 18. It's been my song since I was 17.
So that's a helpful song or a harmful song, Lynn?
Totally helpful, because I sing it, I'm 18, and my whole body goes with, I won't torture you any further on the song.
Thank you so much for that.
Yes, but my whole body gets into it, and it's such a stress reliever.
Yeah, and so in those situations, perhaps what we do is help people develop a playlist. If they have a phone or they have access to technology, they have a playlist that they use when they're feeling distress. And those are the songs that they listen to. And that list goes right in their wellness toolbox.
And just think of the conversations. Just think of the conversations and what you're getting to know about people that doesn't come into the usual discourse. Like, imagine talking to me and going, really, Lynn, Alice Cooper, I'm 18, tell me more about that song. You would learn so much about me. And it'd be a fun conversation. Those are the kind of things that also make this so valuable, because it's doing good work that's going to be helpful, but it also is it's connecting in a different way that's really not all about therapeutics.
And it is very compatible with the role of a peer support specialist to explore all of these different things with people. If I don't know what triggers me, I can't respond when I'm feeling triggered. If I don't know what it feels like, I'm at a greater risk of it getting out of control. If I don't have wellness tools to use, I'm going to be relying on everybody around me to quote unquote de-escalate the situation. But what happens if people aren't around me? Does that mean I automatically end up in an emergency situation? Right? Our well-being, our wellness self-management is, and supporting people to develop their wellness self-management is critical to the recovery process. Even post-crisis in recovery phase, it's not over with. Somebody went through a crisis situation, they went through an emergency situation. As a peer support specialist or a person in recovery, I'm asking these questions. What did I learn during this situation? What worked? What did not work, and how does my plan need to be adjusted or updated? Are there new tools that I developed? Are there other tools that I'm willing to try out? Do I need to modify my toolbox or modify my plan? Did I learn that that person that I thought was a go-to person is actually not going to be available to me when I call them, and so they should not be listed as a part of my plan? All of those things happen as a result of experiencing a crisis or an emergency situation. So we want to capitalize on the post-crisis time period really well as a part of the planning process. Okay, so Lynn, do you have anything else for us?
Not a thing. I just think this is such an important thing that can really help people feel more empowered. And it's so right in the wheelhouse of peer supporters. You know, this is the kind of stuff that truly brings the peer support aspect to our work, you know, sharing with the folks that you're supporting what helps you in these moments. It's a great sharing process.
Absolutely. And I linked 2 resources that may be helpful. They're free. It's something that you can take a look at as a peer support specialist. One is called the Wellness Self-Management Workbook. You can download it. It has a whole bunch of different activities and conversation starters. It's an actual workbook that you can share with somebody. They can create their own workbook around wellness self-management. And then the other one that I linked is from Texas. It's called Getting in the Driver's Seat. And it's a toolkit about taking leadership and regaining your power over the decision-making, over your planning, over your services, and finding your voice in a service type of setting. That's also free. It is also downloadable. And these are all things that as a peer support specialist, you can do with people. They're compatible with peer support. And yes, they are billable. And I have found them to be incredibly helpful over the years. All right, everybody, that is it. Thank you for having grace with me today while I'm under the weather. I really appreciate it. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we will see you next Friday. No, next Friday is a holiday. We might not see you next Friday.
All right, thank you, everybody.
To be determined. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Shireen, for plugging through. I hope you go feel better.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm going to go crash now for a little while.
Thank you, everyone. Take care of yourself. Stay safe. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.